So, this is my visual essay about how to quote-unquote save Final Fantasy. Now, before we get into it, just a little bit of history about the franchise. Final Fantasy began on the Famicom with Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy III. 3 was never released here in the US when it first came out. It eventually was released, I believe, if I remember correctly, Final Fantasy III was released on a Nintendo system on the DS with the Game Boy Advance. No, the DS, Final Fantasy III. It was also released, if I remember correctly, on the PS3 in the PSP with the Final Fantasy Chronicles Collection. I think it was like a special whatever. That's neither here nor there. Final Fantasy used to be synonymous with Nintendo systems for the first half of the franchise, and I would say the better half. Final Fantasies 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6. 6 considered by many to be the pinnacle of the series. Final Fantasy 7 was the first 3D Final Fantasy game. It began life as a Nintendo 64 game. The work was transferred over to the PS1, the rest is history. Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 were for the PS1. Final Fantasy X was the last Final Fantasy made by Hironobu Sakaguchi, who had been with the series since the beginning. And from there, the series kind of became meh, in my opinion. Basically, but I'm not going to go into that. Basically, here's what you need to know. For the 3rd gen, you had 3 Final Fantasies. For the 4th gen, you had 3 Final Fantasies. For the 5th gen, you had 3 Final Fantasies. For the 6th gen, you had 1 Final Fantasy. Yeah, I know people are going to say 10-2, but 10-2 really doesn't feel like a Final Fantasy game. And Final Fantasy 12, which, while it has the name Final Fantasy 12 is actually a Final Fantasy Tactics game with RPG mechanics. Like, it's more RPG, less strategy. That's it. Final Fantasy during the 7th gen were Final Fantasy 13, 13-2, 13-3. Final Fantasy 13 isn't very good, and it just goes downhill from there with each iteration of the 13 franchise. And finally, during the 8th/9th gen, we get Final Fantasy 15, which is hot buttered trash. We went from getting 3 Final Fantasies per gen to 1 to 2, depending on how much you want to be, how liberal you want to be, and not have strict definitions on what it is. So basically, without much ado, I'm going to talk about how I would save the Final Fantasy franchise. I'm not going to get into what type of game, I'm going to get into what type of games I would make if I controlled the franchise. So without much ado, let's get into it after the cut. Okay, so basically, here's how I would save the Final Fantasy brand. First, we have to deal with the problems. The problems with Final Fantasy are myriad, but the big things is that it's taking too long to make these games. It's just taking too goddamn long. And they're going over budget because it's taking too long to make these games. There isn't, the people who are in charge of bringing Final Fantasy back are basically kind of, how can I put this, unworthy successors to the name. So, I mean, it is what it is. I'm not going to talk about personnel changes because I don't think there really is anyone who could really fix it. But with that being said, here we go with what I would do in order to save Final Fantasy. So, without much ado, here we go. First of all, I would get back the old heads like myself, who, like the more methodical turn-based combat of Final Fantasy. The way I would do this is I would release, I would work on a Final Fantasy that has a very small budget, like at the most $20 million. The graphics wouldn't be ultra fantastic, but they wouldn't need to be. I would basically put out a Final Fantasy product, 50, 60, 70 hour RPG, standard turn-based combat, nothing too fancy. Who would I get to make this game? Why, the people who made Final Fantasies back in the day. I would basically pimp this game out to Monolith Soft. Because they know how to fucking make Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy... Let's see, what else? Final Fantasy 2, 3, 4. What else? I would also do a Final Fantasy... and this game would basically be geared towards old school people like myself, okay? Turn-based combat, or, the Monolith Soft version of turn-based combat, which is, normal combat with cooldowns for special abilities and stuff like that. So time is your resource instead of MP. Makes sense, so you can't spam the same 3 or 4 attacks over and over and over and over and over again. That's what I would do. As far as that being said, let's move on to what we would do for the people who want a more action-y Final Fantasy. I would create a Final Fantasy spin-off series, kind of like how Nintendo did with Metroid Prime. I would do a Final Fantasy series called, I don't know, Final Fantasy Stories or Final Fantasy Tales or something like that. These games would be more action-based, with more, more action-y for people who like those types of Final Fantasy games. Once again, small budget, 20 million. Nothing like this bullshit with Final Fantasy taking, and these would legitimately be good games. I would not use the most hottest, tightest, oh man, look how fucking awesome this engine looks. This engine is insane. I would not go with that shit because, frankly speaking, that just keeps on ruining Final Fantasy. For me, personally. Because, fantasy's an RPG first. RPGs are about, and have always been about, story. If the story's ass, everything else falls apart. Because even back in the day when people were playing, when I was playing Rogue on the PC, which was literally just a series of keys, like it was a semi-text-based adventure RPG where you picked a class, rolled stats, using C++ and QBasic. Like, you were basically just using letters. Like, if you were a ranger, you'd be the letter R, and you'd be moving around on a screen, and eventually you'd get party members, and, they'd have little abilities and stuff. But there were no graphics in this game. Very simplified GUI, nothing insane. And yet the game was still fun because you used your imagination and you had a decent story. That's what good games have. This bullshit with, this game needs to have extraordinary graphics, it doesn't, okay? Final Fantasy does not need... If you're spending over $100 million on a Final Fantasy game, you done fucked up. So there you go. That's how I would save the Final Fantasy brand. As far as this, the story and all this stuff, if Final Fantasy needs to have, if someone thinks Final Fantasy needs, how can I put this? If your idea of a Final Fantasy game means that it needs AAA, it needs, shit, I can't read my handwriting. If your idea of a Final Fantasy game means that you have to watch a manga, you have to read a manga, you have to watch an anime in order to get the story of that game sucks because, if you want to understand what's going on in Final Fantasy VI, you just play the game. If you want to understand what's happening in Final Fantasy IV, you play the damn game. You don't need to read supplemental material in order to fully understand what's going on in that fucking game. That's why people play video games, because, they want to play the game and figure something out. The supplemental material should help make the game more interesting, but it's not designed, oh my god, like, this game, in order for you to fully understand what's going on, you have to read this fucking book. That's ridiculous, and I'm tired of it. So, that's how I would save the Final Fantasy franchise. Give me your comments, concerns, what you think could be done to save the Final Fantasy franchise, and such, when you get a chance. And with that being said, we'll move on to upcoming events and such after the cut. Okay then, so here are the upcoming events. Essentially, we have a 50-50 chance that I might do a podcast Wednesday, if no one else does a podcast, talking about my overall thoughts about E3. If I don't, it's probably going to be done Sunday. Standard BS Busters, our overall thoughts about E3. I have some other videos I'm working on. Tavern Tales will return, where I'll be talking about a campaign that was done that was quite different from the normal campaign that you have in a tabletop game, where essentially we were building a city, rebuilding a city. It was actually quite fun, and how it was structured in a very interesting way. That being said, giving your thoughts, comments, questions, concerns about the podcast after the cut, and that's the end of the video. Peace.